To begin, welcome everyone. Awesome to have you with us today. Quick intro from my side. I'm Kyle Morris. I'm the head of GRC at Scytale. A little bit about my background. I'm a CISA certified auditor. Began my career and studied a BSc in computer science, and then I've moved into the regulatory and security compliance space. So essentially, whatever frameworks from a security overlapping with privacy and regulatory aspects, we cover and are involved with those. Maybe a bit of a big shout, but go out on a limb and sort of say, very proud that to this point in time, from a Scytale, from a compliance side, no failed audits, no qualified reports. The goal's always to keep it that way. So yeah, welcome to all of you. Great to have you with us today, and I hope that this will be insightful, informative, and at the end of the session, you'll have a really, really good understanding on NIS2. So to kick it off, we're going to do a quick poll question. And if you'll give me a sec just to bring that up. So you'll see on your questionnaire or on the screen shortly, there's a poll. How familiar are you with the NIS2 directive? Before I jump into any details, if you don't mind, just on screen, select an answer there in varying levels of familiarity. Is this the first time you're hearing about it? I imagine probably not. Are you really well versed in it already? Sitting somewhere in the middle on screen, if you don't mind just clicking, selecting your answers there, that'll be great. And yeah, I'll give that maybe just the next sort of 10-15 seconds. I promise I will give more detail and insight into it. Wanted to just right off the bat see where people's understanding is sitting at right now. So I'll give that maybe a few more secs. And then, yeah, if you haven't yet voted, I'm going to just end the voting. And we're currently just sharing the results. Okay, we're sitting somewhere in heard of it, don't know too much about the details, or somewhat familiar. So awesome. I think that's a really, really nice position and a crowd that we are working with. And it's a good starting point. So to dive right into it, well, we're not here to talk about SOC 2 directly or anything else. We're here to talk about NIS. So the Network and Information Security Directive. What is it? And maybe the purpose of how we're going to facilitate this webinar. I've got some slides. We've got some questions. Please, throughout it, as much fun as it is me chatting to a screen, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat pod. Let's make it as interactive and collaborative as possible. But yeah, we'll essentially be going through some content, and the goal from my side is just to make it as practical and informative for you as I can. So it's an EU directive. You'll see that's highlighted. And the main reason for that, I mean, maybe really touching on the first point, is it's not a regulation. So the difference obviously being, if you go and look at sort of textbook definitions, a directive borders more on the side of there's guidance, and then your different member states each have certain rules on how you would implement this within your region and country specifically. The goal of NIS2 is to strengthen cybersecurity across critical and important sectors. And I'll get to that in a second. But if there's one thing you take away from today, and one sentence that if anyone in the street or in the office passing were to say to you, what is NIS2 and what is the goal of it? It's to improve that level of cybersecurity and make sure that businesses are more resilient, more prepared, and that they can really reduce the number of incidents and attacks that take place. If we're talking about who it's relevant for, well, anyone within the European Union, as well as people outside of that are doing business operations within the EU, or anyone in the UK that wants to do business in the EU. So you can see we've got a huge EU focus, but the scope isn't quite that limited. It's a lot more broad. And then again, just reiterating the point, the focus, we want to mitigate as far as possible cybersecurity risks. And we also do this by improving the incident reporting process. So let's go into another poll. Again, I know straight off the bat, one sort of survey and then another poll right away. Give me a sec to pull up the second question. So really nice one, and you'll see how this is going to tie into a few other questions. Have you, within either the organization you're a part of now or previously in your history, have you ever, I'll even expand the scope of the question and say, have you been involved with any other security frameworks? Have you done SOC 2 before? Have you done ISO? Have you been involved in the process directly, indirectly? Where are you sort of sitting at? And that can obviously just set the scene as well. Give it a few more seconds. Lovely. There's more votes coming in, so I will wait a whole nother 5 seconds. And then we will just close the polls there. So you can see a mixed bag of results. A couple of you on the call, not yet having completed any security frameworks. Not a problem. We can solve that quite nice and quickly. Some people already compliant with SOC and ISO, or maybe some other frameworks as well. So that's awesome. Sets the scene, and it also helps, as silly as it sounds, maybe pave the way and give a really good understanding of where you're at the moment. So talking a little bit about industries that are impacted, who needs NIS2 essentially. So a bit of a play on words there in itself. We're talking about essential and important sectors. And before I even talking about the specifics of it, really key to note that involvement, as I think I alluded to in one of the earlier slides. So when NIS first came out, they placed the focus on essential sectors. So if you think about any of these critical infrastructure sectors, energy, transport, banking, and financial, and I mean, it's quite a big scope as well. You're talking banking industries, transport, you could be talking about public transport, air transport. It's a very big scope, but you're thinking really large enterprises and really large organizations and industries. And then NIS2 sort of revisited this and said, okay, but we can cover more, because the more organizations that are going to fall into the scope, the better coverage of cybersecurity processes. So that's just really good for the EU in totality. And they then expanded that scope of offering to include important sectors as well. So think about any of the cloud service providers. You might directly be one. You might be working with some. Data centers, SaaS, Internet of Things, as well as emerging tech. So you can see how we've gone from really, really key, critical, established sectors to a lot more supporting sectors, if you will. And really the points I want to get across with that is, you might be looking at this now and thinking, okay, we don't fall into critical. We're not part of energy, transport, banking, or financial, but it could very much still apply to you. And as we go through this webinar today, I'm hoping you're going to see as well the value from it. That's obviously a big goal from my side in a compliance space, what you need to do. And I mean, again, just thinking of some sectors within it, maybe making that list a little bit longer or a little bit clearer. Think about public admin, financial markets, healthcare as well. That obviously falls into critical. And I mean, then maybe a little bit more of the supportive or important sectors, your digital service providers we've already mentioned, logistics, freight companies. That scope is really whatever's supporting it. So if that isn't clear and I've totally confused you, feel free to pop a question in the chat and say, Carl, you've absolutely lost me at this point. Or if we're good and there's maybe a little bit of a light or a light bulb moment going on, awesome. We're going to move on to some of the key insights around it. So going back to that very first point I said, someone asking you, what is the purpose of it? Risk management, incident reporting. There is a compulsory aspect within NIS2 that you have to implement risk management processes to deal with cybersecurity incidents. Practically, what that means, we'll get to in a few of the slides times and what an incident actually means. But for the few of you that mentioned, you've already done SOC, you've already done ISO. You've already covered risk management procedures, right? This isn't an unfamiliar concept for you. You need to identify risk within the business, and maybe you've done it at an organizational level, or you've done it at a change management or a product level, but there's a really good chance you've already covered incident, cybersecurity, and I'll even throw in the word resilience measures and practices there. And maybe then moving on to the incident reporting process, specific requirements and timelines within NIS2. That's also coming up shortly for you, but there's a requirement. Within 24 hours of being made aware of an incident, there needs to be a process that you've put in place, and you need to be alerting and following the necessary steps to mitigate, manage, and control, obviously, the impact of that risk. So start thinking, all of you from other security frameworks, maybe incident management policies. You've got a root cause analysis testing or procedure that you do. Anything around those processes. And key as well, improving that cybersecurity posture. The timelines that NIS2 sets out are really, really short. And the reason being is just for people to take it a little bit more seriously. So just to sort of have guidelines and say, you need an incident reporting process, but, well, there's no set sort of timeline for response. Well, okay, you're not going to sort of prioritize it. Maybe you'll get to it in a week, and the impact of that can be far wider sort of impacted within it. So what NIS2 defines as an incident and what your obligations are, you obviously could get a minor incident, a major, and I mean major obviously borders on significant as well. So if an incident causes severe operational disruption or financial loss, and I mean, anyone in business, that probably makes sense. If your company is going to lose money or you can't provide the product or service directly as you operate or to whoever you operate within, if you're again a sort of support service to a critical industry, this is a significant incident. And like you can see as well, if there is considerable, and we sort of get into a little bit of the more accounting or legacy compliance terms here, if there is considerable material or non-material damage, that also borders on the significant incident. So you can think about it. In this day and age, you're probably familiar as well with more of the privacy frameworks around the protection of personal information, healthcare information, and sort of your rights within it and the requirements for you as a business when collecting that sort of data. If there were to be an incident and your entire business is shut down and you've unfortunately ended up in the situation where you've leaked a whole lot of personal data, well, that's pretty severe. So I think you can, again, if you've got any questions on this, it's maybe not making any sense, pop it in the chat and let's discuss it. But that's, again, just the NIST definition of what a significant incident is. Now talking a little bit about those reporting steps that I've mentioned already. Really short timelines. What does this mean for you practically? Well, first things first, within 24 hours, so that first day of becoming made aware of an incident, and that is where these sort of guidelines, well, you need to have monitoring tools in place, and this whole process and framework obviously talks about that. It's not a case of you're going to be appropriately compliant because you don't have any monitoring tools in place. So, you had a significant incident, but you were only made aware of it 3 weeks later. There's a bigger problem at hand there than the actual reporting process itself, right? So you need to implement those measures if you're using a sort of cloud provider tool to make sure that there's monitoring going on. And obviously you want to automate that, right? You don't want human intervention in terms of identification of it. So you don't want someone sitting, checking a system, refreshing for something to go down. And I hope that actually saying that you're thinking, Kyle, practically that doesn't happen in this day and age. Because, well, yeah, we're in such a modern tech age, everything's automated. You use a tool, you use an additional service within your cloud provider, and that sets it up, runs, and it's going to ping you and say, hey, Kyle, you've got a problem. Someone's trying to brute force into your system. You need to have a look at this. So that's point number one. Really long story for it. Have appropriate monitoring tools, and within 24 hours of being aware of it, there needs to be reporting. What does reporting mean? Okay, and who are you communicating this to? First and foremost, the incident response team that you've identified within the organization, because primarily you want to contain, you want to mitigate, and you want to resolve it. So that's step one. Then in terms of notification and creating a preliminary assessment, this needs to be done within the first 3 days. So between day 0 and 1, you have created or started the reporting, and then at the end of the 3rd day, you've already done the initial assessment. It obviously, you can see it's a quick timeline, placing focus and priority on really trying to control this. And then a final report needs to be created within 30 days of the incident submission. So let's go again back to step 1. You've created that report within the first day. You've been made aware of it. Within the conclusion of that first month or 30 days later, an incident submission has been completed. Of course, this maybe needs to be followed by a big red asterisk, because if the incident is still open, depending on the significance or the nature of it, well, you probably can't have a final closed report then, can you? So the requirement within NIS then is that you have a preliminary update and that it's getting monitored. So again, it might not be closed out, but you're still pretty much following these steps quite closely. Then if we move on to the repercussions. So if I've lost you and you haven't been listening and you just thought there was someone on a call rambling on about some incident reporting process, now's maybe a good time to listen, because non-compliance can lead to up to 10 million euros or 2% of global turnover in fines. That's a pretty hefty penalty for not having good cybersecurity practices in place. A really nice selling point if you are trying to convince your own internal senior management or board for why you should go for NIS, well, I can assure you quite confidently that getting compliant with NIS2 is not going to cost you 10 million euros. If it was, please let me know who it is, because that's a really good business model that they're running on that side. But you can see there's an emphasis and it needs to be taken seriously. And point number 3, and I'm really hoping that a few of you on the call are potentially in a space where you're in senior management roles or you understand this. NIS2 is saying, hey, there's actual personal liability for you in a senior management role. So why this is important and why it's important for me to make note of is it's directly in your interest as a company and as a senior person within the management team to take it seriously and implement it. You don't want to sort of have a fine yourself impacting your career and the organization as a result of non-compliance. And finally, and a really, really big business impact, you could be suspended from providing services within the EU. If the business can't operate, you cannot generate money, you cannot run a profitable business. I think that one's really, really clear. I am monitoring the chat on the side as well. If you have any questions on this, pop them there. Let's go through it. Or otherwise, let's move right on to, well, why do you want to complete it? And potentially at this point already, you've maybe answered the questions in your head and are thinking, Carl, you can just go on to the next slides. I know that we need it. Let's get started with it. But if not, let's talk a little bit about this step. So the value for you as an organization, first and foremost, from a compliance side, from a business operations side, you're reducing the risk of cyber attacks and data breaches. It makes sense, right? You don't want to be in a position where every day you're watching over your shoulder, you are concerned about a compromised system. So privacy by design, security by design, you're building a business model that's going to be more resilient to cyber attacks. And in such a fast evolving economy and tech landscape, the reality, unfortunately, is that cyber attacks aren't going to suddenly stop. The sort of impact and the frequency of these is only going to ramp up, because the more tech companies there are, the more data there is online, well, there's a bigger opportunity and there's a bigger pool for attackers to tap into to try and steal data. And of course, the other side sits that, well, holding data for ransom, there's opportunity for very illegitimate ways to make money. So you as a business want to make sure this doesn't happen. Ensuring your business continuity, ensuring your resilience, and ensuring compliance. This, from an organizational perspective and from a sales perspective, truthfully as well, makes sense. You want your business to be up and running. You want anyone using your product, using your organization. You don't want to be sending out emails to have to say, sorry, look, we've had an incident. You're not going to be able to use our tool or product for the next 24, 48 hours. It impacts that relationship. You don't want to be in that position. And from a business sales enablement side, the compliance, someone coming to you, and I will touch on this again, and asking, are you NIS2 compliant? Being able to say, yes, we are. Here's a letter confirming it. Cool. That clears up the conversation right away. There's no back and forth. There's no discussion on it. You're protected against fines and reputational damage. I think you'll probably start to see some trends when I'm discussing this. You want better security. You want to mitigate the potential and the impact of data breaches and cyber attacks. You do this by following a framework like NIS2. So do I need NIS2? And I'm not seeing any new comments in the chat. So going back to one of the early slides, well, maybe it's not that clear yet. So do you operate in one of these essential or important sectors? And this slide, I highly, highly encourage you, use it as a checklist. Do you operate in one of these spaces? Okay, you're not sure? Well, go back to what we were saying earlier, essential. Think about the banking or the financial sector, transport, energy, operational from that side. Maybe you're a SaaS provider. Maybe you're a tool in that technology space working in the Internet of Things or modern digital service providers. Good chance you're falling into that category of important. Where are you doing your business operations and where do you plan to do your business operations? Again, going back to that sales aspect, you want to be able to say, yes, we are compliant, rather than having to have this whole back and forth around why you do and don't need it. Point number 3, would there be a significant impact if your organization's services were disrupted rather? And this goes back to the point where if you, again, don't have this clear picture of saying, okay, we're not essential, we're not important, so we don't need it, there's a good chance you actually do fall into one of those categories, because if you are supporting an organization or you are an ICT provider within it, you're related to it. And part of their due diligence in their supply chain would be ensuring that their third parties are compliant. So I'll take a sales angle and I'll take a practical business angle as well. A essential company that's working with 10 different service providers, it's in their direct interest and requirement at the end of the day that they need to make sure they can continue. And if they can continue, the third parties they work with need to also be resilient. And the other side comes in, okay, maybe the essential organization is working with these 3 providers, but you actually want to tap into that network and industry. Well, you're going to need to be compliant for them to even consider you. I think we've touched on probably most of the points in this. If it's not clear, again, Q&A coming up really, really shortly. But I hope we're getting to a point where you can see practically what you would do with it. So awesome. Practical. Apparently, I know my slides relatively well at this point. Where to get started? Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's do a gap analysis. The purpose of this: what is the nature of your business? Where are you operating? What type of data? What could be the impact if there were to be a data breach or a cyber incident? Okay, now that you've understood that, you can work on the implementation. There might be gaps where you operate in a space that is really, really prone to significant incidents, or you're collecting a lot of sensitive data and disruptions would have a big impact. So we now need to look at how we practically resolve that. So step 1, identify what your gaps are. Step 2, well, your gaps are probably arising because you've got holes in your policies and procedures for how you operate currently, or maybe you just haven't considered this yet. So we work on updating that, because you can't fix how you do something if you haven't changed the definition of what you should be doing, right? So you're going to go through and change those policies. And it also works as an organizational side from a preparation perspective. Okay, we're updating our policy. This is what we're now going to do. And that filters through from an educational side for the employee workforce and the staff for what they should be doing. Enhancing incident response capabilities. Well, this directly ties to point number 2 and 1 as well, and probably number 4. Because look, we're talking about cybersecurity and mitigating that, because that's why we're here on this webinar today. But what this practically means as well, define the practical steps for it. Someone needs to be in charge. The person or the team, as an organization grows, needs to understand what their requirements are. Those timelines for reporting that we spoke about a few slides ago, someone needs to practically know and have defined what to do. We know how well it is to have a procedure and say, yeah, this person is in charge and they will do it. And then the situation arises and there's panic. You almost want someone to just be able to action it, right? So you want clear guidelines and steps outlined that you almost don't even need to think. You just action, you have this procedure, open it. This is what you do as step 1, 2, 3, and you work through it. Strengthening your cyber or your security posture. This is maybe a little bit more intricate and involved than just a single step on a slide, because it goes back to doing risk management, doing vulnerability and threat management, changing your procedures, making sure that you've got good security controls. And I'll maybe pull in a little bit of the security frameworks here, your SOC and ISOs, for practically what you as an organization do. And what strengthening your security posture means, well, it's directly relevant to what you actually do. So if you are collecting and storing data, well, at the process where you are getting data into a system or tool, and you are then transferring it and storing it somewhere, you need to have procedures in place for data encryption, whether that's in transit at a storage level. You need to have resilience practices from a backup perspective. All of these steps, you need to be considering the tools and the third parties that are providing these services to you or that you're using. Do they complement and support the security posture and the policy and procedure definition you have in place? So it's all interlinked. You aren't setting up isolated steps for NIS2 specifically, and all of your other procedures are separate. it's one in the same, and it really attracts and contributes to a safe business. I am seeing in the corner of my eye a couple of questions being posted down into the chat. I'm going to get to those really shortly. I want to go through maybe one or two more slides, and then I will come back to it. But thank you. Please keep them coming. Maybe final points on this slide: training and education of staff, of employees, and of your people. You could now, going back to step 2, 3, and 4, you've defined industry standard policies. This is what must happen. But then organizationally, you have staff who don't follow these procedures. We all know, or we all should know, that the biggest gap or security potential threat in a company is its people. If you have staff that aren't going to, on a day-to-day, implement good security hygiene and aren't going to be security minded, well, your policies probably don't mean a whole lot. So this is always a tricky one. And on previous webinars, it's always a really hot topic for debate and discussion around, okay, how do you actually make sure the people are doing what they should do? Because to send a training and say you have to do this because it's part of your KPIs, well, someone wants to just click the next button to go through it. So a nice step, or maybe a good selling point for this as well, think back to the liability side for senior management. So there is a direct value and a direct need that you as senior management want to make sure that your staff and teams understand what they should be doing and follow the right procedures. I think maybe that's a little bit, or that's enough around the practical steps. So let's think forwards. And we've explained a lot what you should do. I hope it's practical and simple enough. But in terms of the headaches for achieving compliance, so nice graphic on screen now, why companies don't or have not yet pursued NIS2 compliance. Well, it can be really time consuming. I mean, the previous slide had 5 points on it. I think I spoke about it for about 10 minutes. So that in itself, you can see the practical implementation takes a little bit longer. It's complicated. It doesn't have to be. But of course, if you're taking a security directive or you're taking a regulation, and now you're practically trying to say, this reference is mandating I need to do this, that, or the next thing, make it practical for me. The interpretation of what should actually happen to address the requirements isn't always clear. There's tight deadlines, something that I'm hoping maybe got a few of you onto the call now as well, and that we haven't even touched on. Well, today's the 31st of October, and NIS2 actually required that organizations are complying as of the 17th of October. So surprise, you are 2 weeks late if you haven't yet started. Don't let that completely freak you out, because the reality is it's not from the 18th that your business is now being shut down. It's a case of absolutely, you're a little bit behind. You need to play catch up, but the best way I could say you should be looking at it is you need to now be focusing on it. We know it needs to happen. Needs to happen like 2 weeks ago, but let's get going with it. In terms of other deadlines, what we spoke about from a selling angle, you don't want to now have 10 prospects down the line and you aren't able to close those deals, build the business more because you don't have NIS compliance. And cost of implementation. Well, if you're hiring internal teams, you're hiring dedicated consultants, legal advisors, all of that can add up quite quickly, especially if you're in a position where you're busy building the business. So that sort of would be the challenges associated with something like that. And this is where I sort of bring Scytale into the discussion. I don't even think I touched on that from the offset, but I think I did. I said I am the head of GRC at Scytale. So if you aren't familiar with what Scytale is doing, well, we're a compliance automation platform and SaaS provider with the really nice niche that we have the best experts in-house from a compliance perspective. So you get an automation platform that's going to simplify, practically lay out all the compliance requirements. You not playing any guessing games in terms of, oh, do I need this? How do I implement it? And maybe let me actually go to the next slide because it ties it quite nicely together. It's the one-stop shop and your compliance hub. You work on a platform and you work with dedicated people that are going to practically help you understand NIS2 and all your other frameworks. Okay, I need this incident reporting process, or I've touched on the policies and procedures. That's all good and well, but well, where do you even begin? If you don't have a policy right now, you can't really work on changing one. So where Scytale comes into play, and sorry, this is me throwing the sales angle, which I'm really not too good about, but your one-stop shop. Everything's laid out for you, and you have the guidance from a compliance consultant. So this applies to NIS2 as well as to all the other frameworks under the sun that you might need. We spoke a little bit about the SOC, the ISOs, and maybe to just throw DORA into the conversation as well. This obviously being a regulation, it has, and I almost want to say a same but different focus. DORA being an EU regulation, and the focus is on business resilience and continuity. And maybe the last thing I want to say, because I really don't want to make this a DORA podcast, is you can see the overlap. Business resilience and cyber incidents. Well, a cyber incident, meaning your business goes down, is directly impacting the resilience side. And the point that I'm trying to get across there is you can see the EU's focus on building sustainable businesses that are able to withstand and not be impacted by incidents and cyber attacks. That's the goal of where we're trying to go now. So maybe just wrapping up this presentation before we get into a little bit around the Q&A. Are you compliant yet? Between us starting 35 minutes ago and now, if you are, you're amazing. But if you aren't, well, you're still amazing. But we can get you there really, really quickly. And again, like I made mention of, you don't have to make this difficult for yourself. The practical implementation of why you want to do it, well, there's value. Let's maybe wrap up there and sort of touch on that point. So like we've said, there's direct reasoning that you would want to do it because there might be a requirement. If you've got prospects asking for it, and I know I maybe briefly touched on this but didn't quite finish it, that are asking, are you NIS2 compliant? And you're having to explain to them and engage in conversations to say, no, we aren't, but we don't need it because of this, that, and that. Well, at that point, you've probably lost the opportunity to actually work with that organization already. So if it then comes down to that, well, what's the easy solution? Well, do NIS2, because you've then complied with an EU directive. And what this has done is it's helping you with sales and it's improving your cybersecurity posture. So it's not a case of just this grudge purchase that you're doing it because you have to. You're doing it because it's valuable. You are including security in the design of your organization. So instead of you trying to figure out, okay, we're building this business, this is our product, this is our service or what we do, how do we make it secure? Well, having some guidelines probably helps a huge amount in that. So working from a framework like this is going to put you on the right step. It's going to give you the value. You're going to be able to convince prospects easier. And you also have that peace of mind and that reassurance that you have procedures and practical controls in place to be safe and secure. So that's a lot of talking, and I think I need a bit more water at this point. And I want to maybe close that slide deck here and pull up some questions. So we have a question here. I know I can share these. I can't quite figure out how to do that again. I will apologize, but I will read them out to you. So the first question we have is, and I'll read the question out for the audience and then we'll pop the answer. My company is not directly impacted by NIS, but looks like some of my clients operating in the sector are using my IoT. I assume we were referring to their products on their production lines. I put some internal processes in place and using software technos to reduce attack surface. I'm not sure if that's enough. So really good question. And I think that exactly falls into sort of the space around a framework and a directive like NIS. So again, in terms of what you need to be doing, without understanding all of the processes, I obviously don't want to say, yes, this is enough, or no, it's not enough. It's a really good start. And you're on the right track, understanding where your clients are operating and understanding what your product and business line does. So those internal processes, again, if that is helping mitigate the impact and the risk around cyber incidents, you're well on the way. There are specific requirements, and I mean, the NIS directive is online and available for you to go and sift through that information. I want to say reducing that attack surface, again, maybe the best way I can sort of conclude that is, yes, you are well on your way. there are most likely a few additional steps you need to do practically, but that aren't going to change how you've already done the whole business, because you've started, you've got that mindset in place, and now you need to just build on that to make sure practically, I mean, internal processes, like you're saying, to reduce the software or reduce the attack surface. I'm repeating a few things here as I'm unpacking it a little bit. But long story short, after that really long, wild explanation, you're well on your way to understand if it is enough. Hi, Scytale here. We'd love to help. Get in touch with us. On the screen, you will see up at the top, there's a button for book a demo. I ask that you please press that. Let's get into a little bit more of a discussion. Let's go through the process of understanding maybe what you have done is enough and you don't need to practically implement a framework, but that uncertainty, well, we can help get rid of that doubt from start to end. And then we have just one more question. My organization, well, I lie, we've actually got a few. My organization is not in, oh, it's a bit of a loaded one actually. Yeah, there's quite a few in here from Jody. My organization's not in either category of essential or important, so can we say we don't need NIS2 compliance? So, okay, first question, we'll take this part by part. Long answer short, no, you can't say that, because go back to what we said, the involvement. You might not be directly essential or important, or you might not think you are, but by association, and if we maybe go back to the last question, what you provide, you don't directly need it, but you are a third party or a service provider to an organization that does. Again, is it going to come down to that point where you aren't going to be able to work with a company that needs to be NIS compliant because, well, you don't directly need to, but you work with them? A little bit more complicated than that. Look at the relevance of is who you are operating with and the space that you're within. Is it relevant and related to companies that do need to be NIS compliant, that maybe more simply you can see and clearly say, yes, this is essential, this is important? You maybe get a little bit of a clearer answer there. You mentioned personal liability for senior management. What does that mean? Yep, so maybe taking a step back to one of our slides, fines, penalties, in terms of specifically what it is, and this isn't too clear just yet what it is, but the way for you to interpret and look at it is, well, you need to take it seriously. You have you are directly impacted as senior management, and you want to make sure that cyber incidents and attacks don't happen. Look, as senior management, you probably care about the business as well in totality, right? But this means that you need to make sure and work towards the educating of staff and the implementing of processes, because you could be in a little bit of trouble if something were to go wrong. And final question, we were planning to do ISO, now it seems NIS2 is more important. What do we do? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. It depends on the space you're in. It depends is probably one of the best and worst auditing answers you could ever get. But the reality of the cyber landscape is exactly that. So NIS2 being a directive, what are your customers asking for? Maybe a little bit about the outcome of them and the overlap. If you have 20 prospects asking and requiring NIS2, probably a good idea to do NIS2. If they're all asking for ISO, well, probably do ISO. And it might seem like a little bit of a weird answer, but the reason I say that is there is an overlap. Within ISO, you've got processes around organizational procedures and policies. So in the framework and in the ISMS specifically, in ISO, you're going to cover controls around incident management, around leadership, around responding and reporting processes. You're going to have controls from an annex perspective implemented that are covering cyber resilience, security, and the likes. What do you do? Well, again, if it isn't as clear as what your prospects are asking, why do one? Do both. You ultimately want to get to a position where you have all the compliance frameworks in place that, well, anyone that ever sends you a security questionnaire or brings anything to you, you can provide those answers, right? So by doing them together, the outcome of that would mean you are ISO certified on an internationally recognized standard, and you would have completed a directive that's covering specific EU relevant cyber reporting and cyber security processes. So what do you do? Long story short, focus on the one that's most relevant right now, and secondary, do both. And maybe thirdly, don't even stop there. Keep going. Do ISO, do NIS, do SOC, do whatever you need, and build this absolute compliance security master and go and change the world. And on that inspirational note, I'll just close that last question. And that does bring our presentation to an end. I'll have a look and keep monitoring if there's any other questions that we have. I don't think we do. Yeah, so maybe on that point, I just want to wrap up and say thank you, sincere thank you to everyone that's joined and spent the last 45 minutes listening to me go on and on about NIS2. I hope it's been clear. I hope it's been insightful. Again, on screen up at the top, please do click that book a demo button. Maybe you don't really want the framework yet, but you got another question that you haven't thought of now, or it might be relevant down the line. I promise you can do no harm by clicking that button and potentially seeing if there's an angle that you could get some help with. So yeah, we'll give it a couple more minutes. I see a few messages coming through in the chat. Thank you for joining. Thank you for the kind words and feedback. Compliance doesn't have to be totally boring, right? It can be fun, and it can be practical, and it can be valuable. Maybe that's the angle to business personnel or all of you that have joined us on the webinar today. So yeah, wrapping up, Kyle, thank you so much for joining me today. And any questions you have, get in touch with Scytale, get in touch with me. The button's on screen. And apart from that, I won't take up any more of your day. Have a lovely day further. We look forward to working with you. And that's NIS2 in a nutshell. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.